application from Sybil attacks and bots, I would love to talk to you about that. I am also the protocol engineering lead for the Allo protocol, which is why I'm here talking to y'all today. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to go through these 3 questions. So we're really focusing on Allo today. The first question is, what problem does Allo solve, right? If we're building a whole new protocol, what problem is it that we're trying to solve with this protocol? Second question is, how does Allo work? I'll actually give you an overview of the core components of Allo. And then the majority of the time today is going to be spent on this third question, which is, what can you do with Allo? There's actually already people building on top of the Allo protocol. We're going to talk about some of those use cases. We're also going to talk about some sort of pie in the sky things that I hope inspire you to come up with your own ideas. I think I'm really proud of the way we've designed this protocol. It leads to a lot of really exciting things, and hopefully some of these use cases inspire you to think of your own. So starting with, what problem does Allo solve? All right. When we look at all of the capital that's been raised in crypto right now, which is a lot of capital, right? Crypto has given us a lot of tools for doing some parts of the capital life cycle, right? I like to call this the ecology of capital, and there's 3 phases to this. The first is accumulating capital. We all remember the frenzy of the last market of token launches, NFT drops, treasury diversifications, all these tools that were created for bringing capital together, what I call accumulating capital. We've got a really great tool set for this. The other is safeguarding capital. Gnosis, safes, multisigs, as well as Governor Bravo. These are really great tools for keeping your capital safe. And they're good at making really big capital decisions, but they're not good at making a lot of capital decisions. And so we end up with this one problem, which is there's a hole. There's a big open space in how we allocate capital on crypto. And that is in actually allocating that capital, right? This is what Allo protocol, short for allocation, stands to solve, right? Of all the money that's been raised in the last couple of years using crypto rails, how much of it is just sitting in a treasury, right, unallocated? Think of all the flame wars that happen inside governance forums anytime someone tries to propose spending $50,000 on something cool, right? So that's a problem. We see that as a problem, right? And so a lot of DAOs and crypto organizations, et cetera, have come up with grants programs. Well, how many of those grants programs are run with a Google form and a Notion table, right? Given the payment infrastructure that we have, I think that's really sad, right? That's a problem that we want to solve. And that's what Allo is for. When we think about why capital gets stuck, I see 2 things. The first is that we're making these decisions at the root level of the treasury, right? We're not talking about the funds that have been earmarked for our grants program. We're talking about the entire treasury, all the money that's been raised by a particular project. Well, just like you wouldn't go deleting files on your computer with sudo access, it's kind of silly that we're making these funding allocation decisions with root level access to the treasury. It makes them all feel very unsafe, which is why we have these flame wars in our governance forums over pennies, right? Peanut-sized grants proposals. Someone's trying to get $20,000 to do something cool at a conference or something, right? Well, someone feels very threatened by this. Right? Well, they have pseudo access to the treasury. That feels dangerous, right? We need to be allocating and breaking up these treasuries into different portions. The other is everybody gets to weigh in on every single decision, every single capital allocation decision. Every token holder, that's the level at which we're making these capital decisions, is all token holders, right? Well, some people don't like going to conferences, and so they're not going to like the idea of sponsoring them. We see Allo as a solution. This is coming from the 18 rounds that Gitcoin has run. Gitcoin has distributed about $50 million through the quadratic funding rounds. And that's not Gitcoin's money. That's the really important thing to know about that. That's your money, everybody who raised your hands. Only like 15 or 20% of that has come from matching pools that Gitcoin has put forward. The rest of that 50 million is from individual donors like all of y'all. We had a really great case study of this recently where we ran a retroactive citizens round. Gitcoin put forward $20,000 in the matching pool. In total, the community allocated $80,000, so a 4x multiple, right? That's really cool. So with Allo, building on all that experience that Gitcoin has, Allo is a solution for making these capital allocation decisions, right? Our goal is to create basically a playground where you can play around with different funding mechanisms and as a community, use multiple different funding mechanisms, right? Rather than making every decision at the root level of the treasury, have a grants committee, right? Use something like HATS protocol, if people are familiar with that, to decide who's on the grants committee, and those people get to decide how they're spending their money on whatever it is, whatever their mandate is, right? So we get this plurality of funding mechanisms, and we get that plurality within a community, not just across communities, which is really cool. We can also earmark capital. There's a core feature of Allo called an Aqueduct, which lets us a priori earmark capital for things like public goods. So before it actually hits the treasury, we can allocate it towards specific causes, right? We get project reputation. How do you know if the project that you're allocating towards is a good one? Well, we can accrue project reputation. I'll talk a little bit about how and why. And you can use whatever method within your community makes sense to do that. And then finally, we get local decision making, right? Let's have the experts, maybe like the engineers, making allocation decisions on how we should spend treasury funds on things like engineering, right? Whatever the most local version of that is, we can do something like that with Allo. Okay. Next here, we've got how Allo works. I'll give a brief overview of the architecture. If you're an engineer and you're interested in diving more, I'm happy to share the repo with you. Would love actually your feedback and critique on it. But we'll talk at a high level about how it works, and then we'll get into some of the use cases. So there's 4 parts to Allo. The first is the project registry. Next is Allo Core, which is what we call a pool manager. Third is an allocation strategy. This is a contract that you write, right? And then the fourth is an aqueduct. The project registry is a registry of identities, and anything can be an identity. If you're allocating capital, that's an identity, right? If you are a project seeking to be a recipient of a grant, that is also an identity. And it gives us this very lightweight domain space for project identity and reputation. A project is represented by an address, and so anything that addresses can do, you can do with these project identities, right? They're controlled through Allo and the project registry, so it's not like an EOA or a multi-sig or something like that. It's actually kind of a dead weight address that all it can do is be a on-chain representation of your project. So if you and your community are really bought into the attestation thesis, you can use attestations for controlling who gets capital, right? You can look for particular attestations, you can issue attestations to these projects, et cetera. But you can also do this with NFTs or with tokens, soulbound tokens perhaps, and you can even create your own third-party registries. That's a use case that I'm particularly excited about. We'll talk about more when we actually get into some of the use cases. So that's the project registry. So a lot of the use cases that I'm going to get to here in a moment are going to talk about that. But the next one is the aqueduct. A really great way of explaining the aqueduct or understanding the aqueduct is thinking about income sharing agreements. Are people familiar with this term? One person, cool. Max, welcome. 2, cool. So in an income sharing agreement, you pull together a pool of funds, you allocate that towards students to pay for their tuition. They then commit a certain percentage of their income back to that pool of funds. They go through college or whatever, they go off and get a high-paying job. Portion of their income goes back to the pool, right? The pool then goes to investing in more students who then commit the same income sharing agreement, then go off and get jobs and pay back into the pool. Over time, you can actually just remove the principal entirely because enough students have been invested in and are bringing in enough income that you don't need it, and it becomes a sort of self-perpetuating cycle. This is effectively what the aqueduct does for you, your protocol, your project, whatever it is. However it is that you earn revenue, some percentage of that can go into the aqueduct. You can invest it into projects that are going to create TVL on your project or transaction volume or whatever it is. And then over time, that's going to increase the amount of fees that you're earning, which are going to go into the aqueduct, which can be reinvested into new projects, and so on. The meat of the protocol, though, is in creating an allocation strategy, right? This is the contract that you write. We'll have a library of these at launch in September, but this is the contract that you write for who's eligible to receive capital. This goes back to the project registry idea we were just talking about. It can be that they hold an attestation or a particular token, or they're an entry in another registry contract, something like that. Who's eligible to vote? This can be all token holders. This can be an allow list. This can be HATS holders for people who are familiar with the HATS protocol, et cetera. But any way of deciding who's eligible to vote. You'll have some voting logic. This can be something like how Governor Bravo works, where you're taking a snapshot of people's voting power and then using that. It can be through donations. This is what Gitcoin does. When you're donating, you're actually voting for a project. It can be using a credit system. It can be using a governance token. It can be, these are just the ones that I'm thinking of, right? There's lots more. Last two here, you've got an allocation strategy, right? So you want to do quadratic funding. You can bring quadratic funding to just about anything now. You can do direct grants, paying out in a lump sum, or you can do something like an RFP process. In that case, only one person is receiving the entire pool of capital based off of whoever is deciding, right? Distribution here, you can transfer all the funds in the pool in a single lump sum. This is what Gitcoin does. We basically it's kind of like an airdrop, except we're airdropping you USDC or ETH from the matching pool, but you get it all at once. You can set up a stream. Sablier V2 just launched. You could create a version of Allo protocol that sets up streams, right? Then streams funding to projects. You could also do something like milestone-based payments, where they have to come in and make a request to your allocation strategy for the next pool of funds. Okay, so that's the overview. 4 pieces: project registry, Aqueduct, allocation strategy, and I'm so nervous I actually forgot the 4th one. Allo, the core, the pool manager. Cool. All right, so what can you do with Allo? I'm really excited to talk about a couple of use cases. As I've said, there's actually a couple people outside of Gitcoin who are already building on top of Allo. It's still in sort of a beta. We're launching in September, pending an audit, but this is going to give you a couple of ideas for things that I hope that you'll go build on top of it. The first is this idea of continuous public goods funding within your ecosystem. So whatever your ecosystem's definition of public goods funding is, you can do something like that. Here you're using that Aqueduct that I was talking about, right? Some percentage of your protocol fee or whatever it is, NFT sales, something like that, is going to go into the Aqueduct. After a certain period of time, or once a certain amount of funds have been raised, you're going to distribute that Aqueduct in another round of funding into projects that you as a community feel are going to be promising in driving more growth for your project. That's going to generate more revenue for your fee structure or whatever it is, which is going to replenish the Aqueduct. And over time, if you're successful, the Aqueduct is actually going to replenish faster and faster with each sort of round of funding. Okay, cool. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. One thing that we're really excited about here is this is going to create basically a mechanism for playgrounds. You saw all the different parts of an allocation strategy. Well, you can mix and match for whatever is useful for your community. If you want to use hats to create streams, you can do something like that. If you want to use an allow list, you can do something like that. Milestone-based payments, etc. There's this whole design space that's now opened up around how you allocate capital. Another exciting one is QF all the things. Basically, you can wrap QF now on top of anything, right? So whatever your protocol is, you can now wrap quadratic funding on top of it. And I'll talk about endowment here in just a second. This is one of the use cases that's already out in the world. This is one that I'm really excited about. This is called wrapped voting, right? You can do this with QF. You can do this with any allocation strategy. But whatever your protocol's mint, deposit, fund, whatever method is, whatever method it is that you're trying to incentivize within your protocol. You normally do that with something like staking or with yield. Well, now you can do that with an allocation strategy like QF or something else entirely. Great example of this would be pool together. People here are familiar with pool together. You deposit funds into a pool that generates yield. Then there's a sort of lottery mechanism for how that gets allocated. Well, you could attach a bonus to this where not only does you get your return back, not only does the pool go through that whole lottery mechanism, but if you had an additional pool or a secondary pool of capital, you could distribute that to pool together pools based off of which one people are investing in, right? And so you get this kind of like added bonus. Project curation. The project registry, I think, is going to be a really exciting part of Allo, right? You can use tokens to curate particular projects. And so, what is a DAO other than the sum of its projects? Well, you could use a token to curate these on chain, right? Anybody here familiar with the term token curated registry? A couple people? Yeah. Y'all have probably been in crypto since before 2017. Token curated registry is just like it sounds. It's a contract that is a registry. You use a token to curate entries represented by an address on that registry. Well, you can do this with Allo. Those projects are going to be represented in the project registry. They get an address. Now, you and your community can use your governance token to curate which projects are official projects within your community. Cool. Part of that, too, will be grant scouting and curation, right? You can do this at the community level, but you could also do this as an individual, right? Mantle just announced they have a $200 million ecosystem fund. I don't know how they're going to distribute $200 million. That's just so much money. Well, one way that they could do this is you could become a trusted member of the community, someone who is effectively a scout for them for grants making. They allocate capital into your pool that you manage through your own allocation strategy. If you would like, this is optional, but if you would like, you could potentially take a fee on that allocation strategy so that, if they give you $10 million to allocate into projects, you take, 5% or something like that. And then because everything is just an identity in Allo, you as an allocator get to accrue reputation as well, right? And then the last use case here I'll talk about is running grants programs on crypto beyond Web3. This is 2 projects that I'm really excited about. These are both projects that are currently building on top of Allo. The first is Endowments Universal Impact Pool. If you're not familiar with Endowment, it's the largest on-chain and the largest online registry of nonprofits in the world. It's all through crypto rails. You can donate directly to nonprofits all over the world. Well, now, as of effectively last week, when you're donating to a nonprofit on on Endowment, you're also voting on how a matching pool should get distributed on Allo back to those nonprofits. This is that sort of wrapped voting, layered QF use case that I was talking about just a moment ago. You can also, this is a fantastic use case of it, you can just contribute directly to the Universal Impact Pool and know that it's going to get distributed across nonprofits based off of the signal of the crowd, which nonprofits are receiving the most number of donations. Finally, there's a group here in ECC that was actually just in Togo, the West African country, onboarding people to Web3 because in September, we're going to be running a QF round. I'm working with Impact Stream to do this. We're going to be running a QF round to fund public goods in Togo. And the public goods that we're talking about here are things like wells and schools and hospitals. They're all going to use Web3 Rails to do this. Everything is going to be on chain. This is great because it's all way more auditable and transparent than the normal cash grant system that they use. And they're going to get to use the wisdom of the local crowds to determine who should receive grants. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Sorry for going long. That was rude. Anyway, that's my talk. Thank you so much. That's a bunch of use cases for Allo. If you've got questions, I would love to hear them. Otherwise, I would love to just offer you to follow along. We've got Allo Protocol on Twitter, and then I'm 0xZakk on Twitter. Would love to chat with you afterwards about any use cases that you might want to dive deeper on.